We are your hosts, Nikki Shore and Jesse Swain, and you are listening to the American Journal of Infection Control podcast, Science into Practice, brought to you by the Association for Professionals in Infection Control and Epidemiology to highlight work published in our peer-reviewed journal, ACHIC.
Join us as we speak to those in the field of infection prevention and control, like us, as well as other experts, to learn about some of the latest research in the field and how it can be put into practice. We hope you will listen in, learn something new, and apply this information to your work. If you are not a researcher already, we hope this podcast will get you thinking about areas where you can carry out your own research. Hey, Nikki, how are you?
Oh, hi, Jesse. I'm well. I'm a little sleepless with a baby at home, but loving it. We're at a fun age.
Yeah, that's a super fun age where you're sleep deprived and,
Yeah. Wish me luck today.
So, did you know that raw chicken gives you salmonella?
Where's this going?
But did you also know that raw salmon doesn't give you chickenella?
Okay, I see. You know what, Jesse, that's actually really fitting, because today we're talking with Lisa Stancill and Madison Ponder, and they're going to talk about their article titled Methodological Challenges and Lessons Learned Through Conducting a Hospital-Based Salmonella Javiana Case Control Study. And I have to admit, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing Javiana correctly, because I've only really seen it as Salmonella. Do you know, Jesse, if I'm pronouncing that right? Or
I don't know, but I think it's close enough.
And you know what? I'll let Lisa and Madison clarify it. Lisa Stancill is an epidemiologist and works as a data analyst in the Infection Prevention Department at the University of North Carolina Hospitals. She is responsible for providing an analytical, data-driven perspective to the infection prevention operations and automating processes for data collection and reporting. She graduated from the University of Maryland, where she earned her Master's of Public Health degree in Epidemiology, and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she earned her bachelor's degree in biology with a second major in sociology. Her healthcare career has focused on promoting the use of high-quality data to make the hospital a safer place for patients. Madison Ponder is a Pharmacoepidemiology PhD student at the University of North Carolina UNC Chapel Hill. Prior to starting her PhD program, she received her master's in biomedical and health informatics and bachelor's in environmental health science, both from UNC. Her research interests include antimicrobial prescribing patterns and investigating ways to optimize antimicrobial prescribing to reduce adverse outcomes in antimicrobial resistance. When presenting her work, she enjoys creating visualizations to represent results more clearly. So, welcome, Lisa and Madison. We're so happy to have you guys.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
So, Salmonella food-borne outbreaks, not good to begin with, but in the hospital setting, yikes, that's bad. Can you give us a little bit of background on the situation?
Yes. So we experienced an outbreak of Salmonella in our facility and another hospital about 50 miles from ours, beginning in early November 2021. Initially, we identified 7 patients, but after additional case findings, communication with the state, and whole genome sequencing, our total cases ended up being 25 between both hospitals.
Oof, that's scary. Now, I noticed that the study type is a 2-to-1 matched case control study. Can you talk about how a study like that is set up?
Yes, so a case control study is a standard epidemiological study design where we separate people based on whether or not they have the disease, Salmonella in this case, and then we look back on exposures to find any differences between the group who got sick and those who didn't. For this specific study, we matched 2 controls to each case in order to have more statistical power to better detect differences between the groups. And also matching helps us to address confounding in our estimates.
Thanks, Lisa. That's great. A great explanation of the type of control study. So what are some of the challenges associated with food outbreaks in healthcare facilities in particular?
Well, of course, our patients are typically immunocompromised, but also according to the literature and our own scenario, these outbreaks tend to affect multiple facilities.
And how did Hospital A find out about Hospital B? That seems like interesting that one would know sort of the circumstances of what was going on within that other facility.
Yes. So the state was actually the one who put these two pieces of information together and informed us about the outbreak at Hospital B. And then our department followed up with infection prevention at that hospital to collaborate.
That's awesome.
And I find I'm so curious about that just because that's kind of it's a nightmare situation for an IP. And I'm so curious as to how that discussion was initiated between the health department and the hospital. Can you tell us about that phone call? Like, who called who and said, hey, we got a problem?
Yes. Well, this is actually a great question and a good plug, too, because our department actually has a public health epidemiologist on staff whose position is partially funded by the state. And she acts as our liaison between the hospital and the health departments. And she was the one. Yeah, it's very neat. We have a few throughout the state. And then she was the one who initially made that phone call and communicated. And then we kept those communication channels open and were in regular, communication and had phone calls with them throughout the outbreak investigation.
Boy, I bet her heart sank to her stomach when she had to make that phone call. Now, the study noted that any patient admitted for more than 3 days with diarrhea that had a negative C. diff screen was then tested with the GI pathogen panel. Did that unearth additional cases?
It actually did not. We did this as part of our due diligence with the investigation, but all of our cases were actually found in the course of clinicians testing and having GPPs done on patients who were experiencing symptoms.
And then you mentioned, as part of the study, accounting for the confounders. What were some of the potential confounders that for increased risk of infection?
Yeah, so we considered a number of confounders for this study. Of course, the big one we think about is immunocompromised status. So any patient who has a solid organ transplant, someone who is actively receiving chemotherapy, patients who have HIV or CD4 counts below 200 cells per cubic millimeter, and then also patients who are on high-dose steroids. We also considered use of H2 blockers or antacids between admission and our match dates. So a few of them were ranitidine, famotidine, and sodium bicarbonate, just to name a few. And then finally, we also considered patients who had been using antibiotics recently or during the time of the match date.
Oh, man, it's just scary to think of an outbreak in the hospital. All those different variables that go into it. Again, I can imagine my heart dropping into my stomach having to make that phone call.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges associated with actually collecting valid data for this study?
Yes, so there are quite a few that we found. First, our patients move around the hospital often, and especially in the case for our maternity wards, they don't stay for very long. So it was difficult to find controls that were on the same units for the same amount of time as our cases, who also weren't sick, which leads us to our second challenge of finding healthy controls. We wanted patients who didn't have acute GI symptoms and weren't tube fed or NPO during their stay, which becomes pretty complicated when needing controls from our ICU units and step downs. Even more too. The list goes on, and one critical piece of information we didn't fully appreciate until this endeavor was that the nutrition and food service records actually get overridden when a patient is readmitted to the hospital. So their previous order history is wiped clean.
Oh, that's difficult.
Yes. So sometimes we found a control patient who fit our matching and inclusion criteria that we couldn't use due to them having a more recent admission and no food order data from our encounter of interest.
Bummer.
Yeah, and I want to talk about how you guys kind of came to the conclusion that the fruit cup was the culprit, but before that, that leads me to several other questions, like, did your investigation include any interviews with patients? Because that seemed, that might have helped since the previous record got wiped. Or, were there any other businesses or anybody else in the public identified as having salmonella from the fruit, or any of the staff or visitors?
Yes. So for the first one, as far as the patient interviews, we didn't do any from our point as the hospital. I know that the local health departments did a few of the patient food histories and interviews.
Okay.
But that was kind of beyond our scope because many of these patients had been discharged by the time we were looking into the investigation. And then as far as any other businesses or staff or things, our strain, so Salmonella Javiana, was actually detected in Ohio and Virginia and additional cases in North Carolina, but none of those were associated with hospitalized patients. So us and the other hospital were the only ones that had an association between being in the hospital.
And one of the reasons I asked is because I know staff and visitors, and if I were a visitor and there was like a delicious looking fruit cup on my husband's tray left over, I might be like, oh, you're not going to eat that? I think I will. So I wondered if that had spread to anybody else, especially staff, sometimes they're...
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yes. So we were in close communication with our occupational health department. We're lucky to have a really great relationship with them. And while we did have some staff that were out on GI illness, they did follow up, and none of those were associated with our strain.
Oh, good.
But yes, that's a good point. And another thing with relying on order data is that it doesn't always align with what the patient actually ate.
Right.
Perhaps they intended to eat the fruit cup, but then their wife got to it first. So.
And of course, being in the hospital, these patients are much sicker and more vulnerable to these kind of illnesses.
Right. So how did you come to the conclusion that the fruit cup was the culprit?
Well, to start, as Lisa mentioned, these fruit cups may or may not have been eaten, but they come alongside many of the meals served at least one of the hospitals. So that being said, our cases needed to have been exposed somehow. And something like the fruit cup is entirely plausible, considering so many cases had evidence of it in their food record. But that wasn't necessarily the case for a lot of the other foods. And so during our analysis, we're able to see that there was greater consumption of the fruit cups overall in patients who had confirmed cases. And then our overall matched and adjusted results showed that there was an 8 times the odds of being a case when you were exposed to the fruit cups. We also had additional information that was provided to us by the state and the Department of Agriculture because they were also doing their own investigation on the side. And they let us know that there was a common melon distributor between both of the hospitals. And that distributor had provided melons to both sites during this time frame.
Yeah, I thought this was really interesting too, because the list of foods that were included in the study to determine what the cause was so big. So I thought it was amazing that you were able to actually narrow it down and figure out where this was potentially coming from. Can we talk a little bit more about the data analyzation and maybe about attack rate and how that was used?
Yeah, so the attack rate, for starters, is the number of exposed cases divided by the total number of people who are exposed. And by being able to look at all these attack rates for each of the dozens of foods we had, it really helped us hone in on each exposure that we're interested in and only those individuals who happen to be exposed. So you can kind of imagine that if there are more exposed cases and fewer exposed controls, then you'll see a higher attack rate, and vice versa. And for the food cups in particular, it was about 52%. So again, we know that it was pretty common, split about 50-50. And these are proportions. So it can be really helpful to summarize information, but they have the limitation that they can appear high when case and control numbers are actually pretty low. So for example, if there's only one case who is exposed to a food item and no controls were exposed, then you would have 100% attack rate. And that's, fairly implausible that this one food that one person ate is the cause of the food outbreak. So we can kind of, we can make some eliminations by looking at this big picture. And we incorporated this into a set of criteria that we kind of set. Meeting this criteria helped us narrow our list down from 63 foods to just 6.
Yeah, that was like I said, a huge list of foods. Can you talk a little bit about the heat map as well?
So the heat map, for starters, is really cool in color. So if you're just looking at the main article, you won't see the color. But if you go to our supplemental table, you can see where we have everything colored either green, orange, or red. And those shades correspond to the foods that are unlikely to be causing the outbreak. If they're green, and the red and dark is going to be showing corresponding foods that are more likely to be causing the outbreak.
That's really cool. I love, I think the heat mapping is really cool because I think it's a nice visualization of your data and sort of gives you sort of a mental picture of what's going on.
Definitely.
I'm curious too, I know the food prep and cooking areas were terminally cleaned and looked at and investigated. Did the investigation look at how food is handled or prepped at the hospitals?
Absolutely. This is one of the first steps that our department took when we discovered that there was an outbreak going on. So we did, like you said, multiple rounds of terminal cleaning and kind of just did some observations in food nutrition services in the kitchens here at the hospital. And not only that, but the state came in to look at our kitchens as well. That's always
fun having the state in. Do you know who manufactured the fruit cups or other foods that were suspect? I know that it's odd. Some foods out that are sold out in the public, some foods they fall under the purview of the FDA, and some fall under the purview of the USDA. And do you know whether or not there's more rigorous inspection standards for hospital foods or how any of that works?
I'm not sure as far as the inspection standards for our foods here at the hospital, but I can say that our fruit cups were assembled on site. So the traceback really involved looking at the individual fruits, so cantaloupe and pineapple, and that the FDA was actually involved in addition to our state's Department of Agriculture on the traceback for the food distributors.
And I wonder, too, if that's why sometimes certain food items in hospitals might be prepackaged is because you start to eliminate some of those touch points that might lead to something like this. Mm-hmm. But how lovely to have a nice fresh fruit cup, right? So it's kind of you have the give and take there a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Just for the record, I would have been cleared of eating any of the fruit cups because there's evil cantaloupe in there. So I would have been fine. I know you guys were worried.
Yeah, I think I probably would have been the same. But so coming out of this situation, from both of you, what are some of the biggest takeaways from this work? It sounds like you both were involved in sort of various parts, and I think this isn't something that we commonly experience, thank goodness, in a hospital. So what are some lessons learned and tips and tricks for our listeners out there?
Well, to start, I think the food record was such a big limiting factor for this study. It would have been so great if our food record was somehow connected with the patient's record, or at least maintained and saved beyond single admissions. So we would have had that better ability to match cases and controls. And then because we were also limited by data availability and statistical power, we had to try different approaches to get a better understanding of what was going on. That's why we reported so many different results. We had huge tables. But ultimately, we just wanted to figure out what was happening as quickly as we could and ensure that it wasn't going to happen again. And I imagine any other infection preventionists would feel the same way. So sometimes these studies are, quick and dirty, but still they're really important and valuable to keeping our patients safe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Lisa?
And to go along with what Maddie said, nothing is straightforward. Establishing strong relationships and communication channels to make outbreak investigations run quickly and efficiently when they are initiated is very important. And
Absolutely.
we also wrote this manuscript with a focus on the challenges we experienced rather than a standard summary of our case control study, because we thought it was beneficial for readers to understand and anticipate some of the roadblocks that can occur, such as selecting controls and then the differences in operations between facilities that weren't immediately obvious to us. And finally, to understand that we live in a very interconnected society, so outbreaks can and often do span multiple hospitals.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. And thank you both for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one piece of advice for any new infection preventionist is to start creating relationships, developing relationships, especially with your local health department and state health department. So good advice. Yeah,
networking
thank you, ladies.
is so important.
It is. It sure is. It's an interesting study because that's kind of a nightmare situation for any IP, and I'm sure it was discovered at 4:30 on a Friday. So, thank you guys for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you for having us.
AJIC Science into Practice is created by the Association for Professionals in Infection Control and Epidemiology with input from the APIC Research Committee and Pat Stone and Jean Brandt at AJIC, and APIC staff Shanina Knighton, Chris Ruiz, Bobby Gulshin, Christine Miller, Kaylee Deaton, and Kelly Lynn Russell. We work in partnership with Human Factor and audio tech Blake Alton. To hear other AJIC podcast episodes and to access information about this podcast and the field of infection prevention and control, go to our website at ajicscienceintopractice.org. That's AJIC scienceintopractice.org.